My guest is Mary Powell, who owns a goat grazing business in Longton, Kansas. This means that she loads her 75 goats up into a trailer and transports them to locations that need the services of grazing goats. She calls the goats her crew. Goats can be superior to alternatives, such as mowers, brush hogs, weed eaters, and toxic chemicals. They can also do well in places that are either difficult or unsafe for getting heavy equipment, such as places that might have an open well, or places that might have scrap metal that could puncture tractor tires, or places that are hilly or rocky that are difficult to get heavy equipment onto and unsafe for the operator. Goats also work fast and they tend to like problematic species, plant species, such as lespedeza, honeysuckle, and poison ivy. So let's talk with Mary Powell about her goat grazing business. According to Gardner News of Southwest Johnson County in Kansas, Mary Powell is in the business of clearing weed and brush-choked plots of land, but she's not using mechanical tools or chemicals. She has a crew of 75 goats. The company name is Barnyard Weed Warriors. Mary and her crew travel all around the state of Kansas every year, and they just returned home after an 8-day job in Gardner, Kansas. Mary, how are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. We're trying to recoup from the summer.
Right. Mary, how'd you get started in this business? Tell me about renting goats for clearing brush and grazing.
Well, it started out, I got into the goats in 2012 with my landlord, and I was having to come home from work every day, letting the goats out of the pens out into the pasture because we didn't have good fencing around the pasture, and I had to use my border collies to keep the goats in the pasture. I got tired of doing that because I was spending 3 and 4 hours a night in the evenings doing that, and I decided if I was going to babysit the goats, I was going to get paid for it. So I got the goats out on the road, and I'm getting paid for babysitting the goats and doing weed and brush control at the same time.
So, and what motivates you to do this work? Is it just a living, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I cowboyed for 27 years, so there's a little bit of a cowboy spirit behind me. I like being out in nature, and most of my jobs are away from the city. I do occasional jobs in town, but I really like the ones out in the country because I can go several days without seeing anybody, and I like it like that. Get to watch my animals, get to enjoy
Mhm.
nature, and kick back and relax, read a book. I do cowboy poetry, so I write my cowboy poetry, and I enjoy nature and in the best form by being out in it.
What are some of the benefits to landowners of using goats for grazing instead of some of the alternatives?
Oh, there's all kinds of benefits. First off, um, the animals can get in there where machinery can't. We've found open wells on properties that have been overgrown to the point to where you can't get in there. And if a person was to go in and use machinery, they damage some machinery. We found on this same site where we found an open well, we found some
You're talking about oil
machinery.
wells, right?
No, we're talking
Oh,
about a water well.
water well. Okay.
Yeah, a water well. One that used to have something around it that you drew water out of. It was a
Mm.
pretty big hole. And then not too far from there, we found some old machinery that had been farm machinery that had been buried, and it was a disc. Well, the disc had been turned upside down, and the discs were still on it, and the disc blades were just barely sticking up out of the ground. They would have shredded a bunch of tires really
Mm.
quick.
Mhm.
So you can get in there with the goats, and of course, goats might get cut on something, I've only had one bad cut in all the years I've been out on the road. And I always have first aid equipment for the animals. So usually the animals don't get hurt. We get in there, clean out the area to where you can see what you need to get cleaned up. Uh, they eat the invasive stuff. They generally leave the native grass. They fertilize in pellets that are very beneficial to the soil, the nitrogen and the organic material that goes back into the soil from the goat berries is very beneficial. The goats are very lightweight compared to cattle, and they don't compact the soil as much as cattle would. They're also very entertaining and relaxing to watch. Goat watching parties are a big thing with goat rental industries. I've had
Tell me
many
more about
customers.
that. I'd like to know all about that.
Goat watching parties.
Yeah.
Okay. It started out by just the neighbors showing up, and when I showed up and they wanted to know what was going on, because here I'm parked in a cul-de-sac backed up to a driveway, and I'm letting out a bunch of goats in somebody's backyard, and we were going to do some poison ivy, and the next thing you know, the whole neighborhood there's watching, and somebody gets out a 6-pack of beer and somebody else brings over some sandwiches, and all of a sudden you got a backyard party going on. I've had some customers plan huge banquets, to come out and watch the goats and just have a great get together. People who live in an urban area who don't generally get to watch livestock or get around livestock, they find livestock very intriguing. And goats are very entertaining, especially if you have some younger goats along. Then you get people who want to get in the inside of the fences and start pulling down branches, and then the goats swarm them, and they think it's really funny that these goats are all gathered around them while they're holding a branch down, and it seems like something very mundane, but to them it's an experience that they have never had before and probably never will again. But we've gone so far as to have very elaborate parties, a planned party that became a fundraiser for the Eudora, Kansas Township Library. And they called the first one was the Great Goatsby Gala. I was raising money for the library, so they played on the Great Gatsby. People dressed up in 1920s clothing. They had goat cheese and a wine called Goats Do Roam. They had a silent auction, but everybody was out there, and they charged people $50 a head to come out and watch these goats eat weeds. I thought it was a little odd, but they thought it was great. These people work in the cities, and they thought it was an amazing thing. And watching the goats is amazing. But they turned it into a big party. So I say, oh, that's fine. Let's have a party. They want to have a party when the goats show up. That's fine. We're not having goat though. And they kind of laugh on that. But yeah, and it's a way for me to bridge the gap between rural and urban America, and show them that animal agriculture is beneficial to the land. And people are amazed, they're mesmerized, and everybody has a good time. I can always guarantee somebody coming to this that's had a bad day, they'll leave smiling. So the parties are a big thing.
How do you manage the goats? You use like electric fences to rotate where they graze?
Yes, I use the electric netting, electro netting that I get from Premier One Supplies. There's other types of electric netting. I've really been impressed with how long this stuff has lasted. Mine's about to fall apart now. I've had it 5 or 6 years. And I use a solar fence charger, and it's It works really well until you have a series of several days of real cloudy, rainy weather, and then it, doesn't quite work. But my goats are generally fence trained, and as long as there's something to eat, they'll stay in the fences, so I don't have to worry too much. The In fact, most of this summer I've ran without the fence charger being on because I've had so many people coming to the job sites this year. We were at a retirement community in June, and I think through the whole week, we were there 7 days, I think I probably had 1,000 visitors. So there was no way to keep the fences hot. The goats had plenty to eat. The only ones that tried the fence were some young goats, and I kind of kept an eye on things. And when I saw them getting their heads close, I'd run over to the fence charger and I'd turn it on for a little bit, and they'd get their heads zapped, and then they'd run off. And a couple of old guys sitting there watching the goats saw that. They thought that was a real hootenanny. They just laughed and carried on. And so every time I had to go to the fence, I'd holler, "Fire in the hole," and they'd start watching. And but the goats generally, they leave the fence alone. And so anymore, I've just, if I see the goats getting close and I don't have the fence on, I just holler at the dogs. And I got border collies that'll run up to them and keep them away from the fence. So
tell me more about your dogs.
We lost my best dog this summer. It was quite of a tragic deal, but the pack has kind of been in a mess since then. I've got, so my oldest dog now is 9. She was the youngest sister of the old dog that I lost. And then she's got her daughter Fly. And Joy's the old dog. Fly's the younger dog. And she's expecting puppies in November. So we're going to have another generation of dogs that I'll be raising. And then I've got Whip, who is a younger brother of Fly. He was returned to me. He wasn't adjusting to the family farm where he was at, and he was getting into some trouble. So we have some bad habits to break. But he's going to be on the permanent crew. And then the puppy that I keep from Fly's litter will be the next trainee. And Fly is the only one of the dogs that I have that is officially trained to the correct herding commands of away and by. And the older dogs, we just learned to work together. And then as I gradually worked into learning more about border collies and how to command them and stuff, and going to the clinics and stuff, I've learned how to properly train a dog now. So now Fly's trained properly. Her younger brother Whip is being retrained properly. And then the puppy to be will be the next step up with training. So I can't do this without my dogs. There's some companies that do it with the guardian dogs. But I can't run.
Guard dogs and herding dogs are two different things, right?
Oh, yes. The guardian dogs are there for protection. The herding dogs, like my border collies, they're the ones that will help me if the goats get out, and occasionally they do. Then I can send the dogs out and they can bring them back to me. They also help me load them up. And they're also good for working dog demonstrations. I have a lot of people that are pretty amazed with my dogs, how they work. Now, the guardian dogs, they just keep any predators out, and that includes humans. And it can be somewhat hazardous to have visitors to the job site if they try to reach in and get the goats or pet the goats, and a guardian dog could accidentally bite them. So I kind of frown against the idea of using guardian dogs unless you're on site all the time with them.
Let's talk about plant species. So what plant species do the goats like, and how's that helpful to the landowner?
Okay, well, especially here in Kansas, we have the tall grass prairie and a lot of native prairie grasses. The goats generally avoid those. What nature had originally put on the land. The weeds are the invasive species that have come in since humans have started coming in on the prairie, and trees. So the trees, usually the bark, the young saplings that are smooth barked, like elm and oak, um, even the cedar trees, locust trees, um, even fruit trees. They'll strip the bark off of. They'll band them, and then noxious weeds like Sericea lespedeza, which is my specialty. We like to focus on that. Highly prolific in seed production, and if we can break the reproductive cycle of that plant, we can control that invasive plant, because it quickly overcomes a prairie if you don't manage it properly. Poison ivy, sumac, Johnson grass. In southeastern Kansas, Johnson grass was brought in as a hay, and now it's a weed, but people still feed it as hay. Up in north central Kansas, Johnson weed's a scourge, and people they don't like it at all. They don't even feed it. You have to be careful with it because it can have high nitrates in it. But the goats manage things that the cattle don't usually eat. And by coming in and eating the junk, that leaves more room for the native grasses to grow back. I've got a neighbor across the road that likes for us to put the goats out on their pasture because there's a large patch of Sericea. And I only do about an acre at a time, fenced off. And when I move that fencing, then the cattle, they swarm in where the goats have been, because the grass is left, and some of the grass is, 6 inches to a foot tall. And they get in there and eat the grass that's been growing, that has been, shaded by the Sericea or overcome by the Sericea. And you get the goats in there, clean that out, and then the cattle can get that. Research shows that you can graze goats in a pasture with cattle, and the cattle will have no negative effect as far as growth or average daily gain. Actually, it's more beneficial because the goats eat the stuff that the cattle won't, and that leaves more room for the new native grass to grow. So it is a benefit to the land to have the goats come in and restore a prairie. It's more a natural way to do it. Burning Sericea is not a very easy thing to do because it scarifies the seed and causes it to germinate. The best way to manage Sericea, in my opinion, is to get the goats in there and get the plant harvested down to where it can't reproduce, and just keep doing that year after year, because the seed that is in the ground will eventually germinate and you will have Sericea. But if you keep it managed with the goats, and the goats come in, clean that area up, the grass comes up, even though there's more Sericea come up a little later, bring the goats back in, and you can just continually keep that worked down, and eventually the prairie will take over.
Do your goats eat autumn olive?
What is it?
Autumn olive.
I'm not sure what that is.
Okay. All right.
I've never really heard of it.
Yeah. The reason I ask is because autumn olive does grow here in the eastern US, and it's an invasive species. I know farmers that don't mind it and think it's beneficial because they can feed it to their cattle. But there are some mine reclamation sites that have become monocultures of two things. One is the Sericea lespedeza that you're talking about, and also autumn olive. And I was just wondering, they're using toxic chemicals to deal with the autumn olive, and I was just wondering if goats would be an alternative to that. It's a bush it's a legume for one thing. It gets up to about 10 or 12 feet, and so.
The Sericea is a legume, so I don't think that there would be the only way to find out is put a bunch of goats in there and see if they eat it, and
Right.
find out if they fall over dead, then it's toxic to them. Not a very good way
I
to
think that's
research that,
unlikely. Yeah, that's unlikely.
but
Mhm.
I don't think that anything in a high quantity can be detrimental to an animal. But there's probably a good chance that the goats would probably eat it. Like I said, I'm not familiar with the plant. But if it's a legume, I would think that the goats would probably gobble it up.
Yeah, I would think so too. Tell me about some of the other plant species that, or no, no, tell me some success stories. Like, does that make sense? Yeah.
Success stories. Well, um, I've had, well, anything that the goats clean up is a success. We've had a lot of people that's had a hard time getting into some things, and they you go into an area that is overgrown and you can't see what's in there. And I've gone into junkyards and they said, well, we don't know what all's in there because it's all overgrown. So the goats get in there, and one of my customers goes, oh, I forgot I had that. So you get in there to where somebody says, oh, it's just overwhelming, I just don't know where to start. You get the goats in there and they clean out a lot, and then people say, oh, well, it's not as bad as I thought, because once the foliage is gone, you can see in there what you have to do. One place was overgrown with honeysuckle and you just couldn't see anything. I had to chop with a machete to get through to put a fence in, crawling on my hands and knees, and just to get a narrow path through there so I could drag my fence through. When it was cleaned up, they could see clear through, and they go, oh, well, that's all that is. I guess I can get in there with a bobcat and one of them mowers, and I can mow down them little stubby things. And I've got some really good before and after pictures. I'm going to have to try to find to show you, because it's amazing what you can do. I'm going to try and pull up a picture or two for you.
Okay.
And share them if you don't mind.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Here is poison ivy. And this is just kind of an area that was overgrown. And let's go back and I'll see if I can pull up the other picture here of what was after we got through with the I would call that a success.
Try to leave it on while we talk about it a little bit, because
okay.
there's a delay. So What are we looking at here, Mary?
Well, this is the picture of where all that poison ivy was growing. Mm-hmm. The goats got in there, and most of it was real tender foliage. There aren't hardly any stems left. It was mainly a vine, the poison ivy vine on the ground. They really ripped into it pretty good. Back here in the background, there's a tree that was stripped of its bark. Of course, you can see my fences there. I had moved. We started out in this under the pine tree. I guess those are cedar trees, where all that poison ivy started. And but they cleaned it up. I mean, I was really, even myself was surprised how quickly and how well they cleaned this area up, because you couldn't get into it. When you've got that many goats eating and stuff, you never know what you're going to get. But you see, the grass was left behind.
Right.
All this area back there, that was nothing but the poison ivy vines and all the vines. And they left the grass, and the grass was about 4 or 5 inches tall. And I'll see if I can find you another. We'll stop share there, and I'll see if I can hunt down another really good photo. I guess Oh, I do have a picture of some lespedeza that
Okay.
that I've. Now I don't have an well, you can see the goats in here, but all this out here is lespedeza, and it's about 4 or 5 feet tall. I was actually standing on the side of my pickup when I took this picture. We had about 2 acres of this to do. It took us about 5 days, 6 days.
So 75 goats.
Yeah, 75 goats will generally do a half acre a day, but it took us about 5 days to do this because it was so thick. This was in 2019 when we did this. I go back to this piece of property every year. It's kind of been my experimental plot for the Sericea. The year before, we really had it under control. But in the spring of 2019, we got lots and lots and lots of rain. And I think every seed that was in the ground germinated.
Right.
Because when I got to it, it was the shortest was 5 foot tall, 4 and 5 foot tall. Some Sericea was upwards of 6 to 8 feet tall in an area of a CRP that I wasn't allowed to graze. And but it's you can see it's got a white bloom to it, and it's kind of a white purplish bloom. And the goats, I like to do Sericea because it's a natural dewormer for the goats. I really, that's what I look for, because I have cut down the number of dewormings that I've done on my goats by grazing Sericea. I think it's the tannin that is in the plant that is what helps keep the worm load in the goats down. And anybody who raises goats knows you got to check them regularly for worms. I don't necessarily have to do that as often. As long as I know they're out there eating Sericea, I know they're going to be okay. And I've gotten rid of a lot of chronic goats that were chronically wormy because I'm grazing the Sericea. Usually the only time I have to deworm those goats is in the winter and fall, late fall, early winter. And then again, in early spring is usually when that's the time period that I have to deworm the goats that usually have problems. The rest of my goats, they don't generally have issues. If I know some losing position in the pecking order, that's when I'll check them for worms. Because that's usually the first thing that the goats will notice at first. If somebody's is a little wormy, it's kind of like it's oh, you've got cooties type deal. Right. The goats start avoiding them, and the goat starts losing its pecking order position. And that's generally before you see any physical signs of worms, like poor hair coat or an eyelid, checking the eyelid where it's pale, and but Sericea is my favorite weed because of that. Okay, this is the other part of that area where I'd showed you that had poison ivy. This you can barely see is a barn here, and all the foliage there. And let's see if I can find the next picture here. This was about 6 hours later. Did that one show up?
It's there, yes. My goodness, 6 hours later.
Yeah. And you see these young elm trees are completely debarked. The goats use their horns to rub up and down the inside of their horn. The goat's horn's shaped like a teardrop, and the pointy part of it's on the inner side, and they rub their heads up and down on that young tree with smooth bark, and they loosen that bark with their horns, and then they pull that bark off with their teeth. So yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's impressive. Right.
Um, but
Do your goats have names?
yes, a lot of them have names. Some of them have names that are not repeatable in public, in genteel public, because they do try me at times. They are, just like a teenage kid, they'll drive you nuts and want to knock their head off if they get too frustrating for you. Um, I have fired some goats from the work crew for not conforming to behavior that is acceptable, like blowing through the fence all the time, or just fighting with other goats. Had one goat that was pretty notorious about hooking other goats with their horns and breaking legs. Broke two different goats' legs, and so that goat went by the wayside. I think it ended up in goat burger heaven.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like my animals to fight. If I can understand a little push and play, but every now and then you'll get a just like humans, they'll get into a fight, and it's something that you have to break up. Recently, I had Cheerio and Brandy get into it, and Brandy was just beating Cheerio up like crazy, and all of a sudden, here comes Frodo, which is Brandy's neutered son. I kept him. He was just everybody liked him, so his personality and everything. So we kept Frodo, and he came and he saw that his mama was fighting with another goat, and he just ran into the side of Cheerio and knocked her flat.
Mm.
And I had to I had to intervene, and I usually take a stick and pop them on the horns, not hard, just enough to kind of, you tap a goat on the horn, they don't like it. It kind of rattles their brain a little bit. But they after a while, and if they still continue to fight, then I'll bring the dogs in and kind of stir the pot a little bit and get the goats moved off in opposite directions, and then I can, things kind of cool down. But they actually had a pretty bad fight, and I was like, something's going on. And I don't know, it was change of weather or something, but they're buddies now, so evidently they were just fighting over a weed or something.
When's your busy time of year?
My busiest time of the year is between June 1st and the 31st of October. And this year I shut down a little early because there was some things that I've got to get done this fall, and I have some other folks doing some weed and brush control, and they kind of took those jobs that I was going to finish off with. And so I'm going to do what I got to do this year, but generally I run from the 1st of June to the 31st of October. So
do these jobs take multiple days, and you spend the night with the dogs and the goats and everything?
yes, most of my jobs are a minimum of 1 day, or 2 days rather. And I do camp out with the goats. There are people who check on their goats daily. They don't stay on the job site, but for me, when I'm traveling, and I do have a tendency to travel quite a ways away from home, and so it's not logical for me to go and go home, and it's not logical for me to rent a motel. I've got a tent, but most of the time I just throw a tarp down, throw my sleeping bag down, and then I just crash out on the ground with the animals. I have a tarp that I hang over the side of the trailer that's kind of like a tent shade thing for the day, and I'll sit there and watch the goats when I'm not moving fence around. I
Enjoy the work?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I sit there and enjoy everything, and then I get to at night I get to look at the stars and the clear sky and get away from the cities. The sky's a lot clearer, and I always enjoy stargazing. So
How do your prices compare with alternatives like, bush hog, what have you?
We are a lot cheaper, significantly cheaper. Um, my rural rates, I have kept quite a bit lower than what I should, but I don't have the situation where I've got to stress out about traffic and unwanted visitors in the middle of the night. But we it usually averages out to be about $1,000 an acre. Um, you know, give or take a little bit, but I charge by the day, and my roll rates for, I think, of course, my grazing rates have gone up because of the gasoline. Um, and for next year, they're going to go up to around $500 for the first day. I have a sliding scale, which for one day, it's for the first 2 days, it's going to be 525. If I'm there 10 days, it's $350 a day. But when you figure in the chemical and the mechanical needs and stuff, it's going to be, it's a lot cheaper to hire the goats than it is to hire a crew of people to come in, because first off, you're not having to pay taxes on income, as far as paying each individual employee. My employees work for food.
Hmm.
Um, and wear and tear on the machinery. If we had taken a tractor into that area where we found the open well and the discs that were buried, we'd have ruined the tires. Could have cut a hydraulic hose. Anytime you mess with tires on a tractor or hydraulic hose or even on a skid steer, you're looking at quite a pretty good chunk of money. Um, and some uh, they charge by the hour a lot of times, 75 to 150 $200 an hour to run machinery. Chemical, you're looking at chemical. Sometimes you have to have a permit to even spray chemical. If you hire somebody to spray chemical, they have to have all the proper permits and paperwork and everything. And then you have to deal with, if you're spraying chemical, what's that drift going to do to your neighbors, is, the liability potential there for your neighbors. So we are significantly lower.
How,
When I
how do
did,
people get in touch with you?
basically they get a hold of us through my Facebook page, Barnyard Weed Warriors. It's
Barnyard Weed Warriors.
on
Okay.
Facebook. And then I also have a website called barnyardweedwarriors.com. And this is for people in Kansas. Now, if you live in another state, we do have on Facebook a group of individuals called Goat Rental Professionals.
Hmm.
And on that Facebook page, they list a website that has a map of all the people who are with the goat rental professionals across the United States. And it is www.hiregoats.com. So it's hiregoats.com.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go there, and they've got a map or a list of all the goat rental people from across the United States. And I'm working on getting a network of goat rental people here in Kansas together, to where I'll be the one, that can get the job. And then I've got different goat producers who want to do this, but don't do it all the time, who can do a job for you, if they're a lot closer than what I am, if they can get to you before I can, or if I'm not able to get to that part of the state. I was out at Hayes here a couple of weeks ago, which that from where I live in southeastern Kansas up there, it would have been about a 6.5 hour drive because I don't drive that fast with the goats. So I had a job up at Salina, which is close to my north farm. So I went up there to Salina, and then from there I went out to Hayes, and it was only 2 hours. So it was a kind of an easier way to do it. A lot of times I do leapfrog jobs too. If I'm going to have a couple of jobs in one area and then there's another one close, then I'll try to get all of them done at this, pretty much at the same time. But the more people we get into this, the better it'll be, because there's more than enough work for goat producers. And this is a great way for goat producers to save money in the summer feeding their goats. In addition to that, it improves their health significantly with a lower worm load. It's like putting them on a new buffet every day, and it's the goats are really content when they're out on the road like that. Now that I've had them in the pens here for about 3 or 4 days, they're not too happy. Every time they see me, they start screaming at me like they want to go out. So I usually take them out for about an hour and a half in the evening with the dogs, and we'll go up on top of the hill, and they'll eat a bunch of oak leaves and acorns, and they'll be satisfied. And then I'll bring them back down and put them in with the hay and the protein block. So, and then I'll go down. I got a job down at the neighbor's. She wants me to work on a patch by her pond, and I told her I'd bring them down and here later this week, and we'll fence it off. It'll probably take them a couple hours to do, and then I'll bring them home. So,
well, Mary Powell, Barnyard Weed Warriors, barnyardweedwarriors.com. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to learn about goats and their benefits as grazing animals, and the ability to, remove brush and leave behind some fertilizer as a bonus.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And if anybody would like to visit with me, all I got to do is get a hold of me through Messenger on my Facebook page. And if somebody's wanting to get into the goat rental, I'd be more than happy to advise them on what they need to do and ideas. And I learned it all the hard way. I had to learn it myself, and because I didn't have a mentor around. But I do know one thing: people find out you're doing this, you won't ever have to advertise, because word of mouth really goes fast, and it's amazing how quickly people catch on, and they'll find you. So sometimes it's a good, you get overwhelmed on it. But it's a good way to raise your goats. It's a fun thing to do. It's entertaining. And you get to pick your own hours. So that's another thing I like. So.
Right. All right. Well, have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining Mary Powell and me for this informative, heartwarming, and I think inspiring discussion about goat rental services. To find Mary online, go to barnyardweedwarriors.com or go to Barnyard Weed Warriors on Facebook. To find goat rental services near you, go to hiregoats.com, H-I-R-E, goats.com, or go to Goat Rental Professionals on Facebook. Thank you and have a wonderful day. One final note to put this conversation in its proper ecological context. Question: do we want to take carbon out of the air and store it in the ground? Yes, we do, because there's too much carbon in the air and there's not enough carbon in the ground. Do we want good quality water? Do we want the rainfall to come down, get soaked up into really healthy soil, and then get filtered through that good healthy soil into the streams and waterways? Yes, we want that too. Do we want abundant habitat for wildlife. Bees, butterflies, birds, dragonflies. Yes, we want that too. And do we want our water cycles, our rainfall, etc., to, yeah, take my word, we want good water cycles. So the way to do that, as much as anything, is to have grazing animals like goats, and to make sure they're properly rotated. Grazing animals have a bad reputation today because of a lot of misinformation. Grazing animals evolved with grass. Grass evolved with grazing animals. It's important for the grass to come in contact with grazing animals so they can chew on it and then they can poop it out, and there's a lot of fertilizer in that, microbes, etc. So the way to have good healthy soil and to have wildlife habitat and to have clean water is to have optimal impact with grazing animals. Thank you.